It's about time we're going to get started. We got a couple of songs here. Oh, land of rest for thee, our silent will, the moment come, when I shall lay my harbor by and dwell in peace at home. Will work till Jesus comes, will work till Jesus comes, will work till Jesus comes, and will be gathered home. I saw that once my Savior's side, no more my steps shall roam. With him I'll break death's chilling tide and reach my heavenly home. Will work till Jesus comes, will work till Jesus comes, will work till Jesus comes, and will be gathered home. Though I through the valley of shadow, or mountain or trouble see, and oft in the darkness I travel, the Lord has been mindful of me. The Lord has been mindful of me. He blesses and blesses again. My God is the God of the living. How excellent is his name. I reach out and say I am happy. I have found prosperity. I praise I have doors ever open. The Lord has been mindful of me. The Lord has been mindful of me. He blesses and blesses again. My God is the God of the living. How excellent is his name.
Philip, thank you. If you are here tonight for the first time, thank you for being here. We are studying the Gospel according to Mark. If you are joining us live or later online, thank you. I hope that this study strengthens your faith and honors your time. Last week, we looked at Mark chapter 4. Jesus was on the Sea of Galilee, and he sat in a boat and shared parables with the crowd that was on the shore. And one of the parables that he taught was the parable of the sower, and we talked about how this is a model parable because understanding this parable helps you to interpret other parables that Jesus taught. We also studied Jesus calming a stormy sea. And I'll turn this on. Jesus calmed the stormy sea, and this demonstrated his power over nature. And the response of the disciples after this occurred was that they were in fear. Who was this? That even the wind and sea obey him. And we left with the thought that it was night. He had calmed the sea, and he had just rebuked them for their lack of faith. And there they were left on that boat on the calm sea, beneath the stars, to think about what he had said and about their own condition. In chapter 5, Mark is going to shift the narrative from the violence of the storm to the violence of a demon-possessed man. Jesus will heal this man. Then he's going to meet a synagogue official whose daughter is at the point of death. And on his way to heal this little girl, a woman who suffered from a hemorrhage for 12 years is going to touch his cloak and be healed. and he's going to interact with her. So I've titled this particular lesson, Imploring Jesus, because we're going to see multiple instances where someone kneels before Jesus, begs or pleads something from Jesus. So let's talk about a principle that you may have heard of, maybe you haven't heard of. It's called show, don't tell. And this is something that we talk about in the circles of writing. Professional writers use the show, don't tell technique to create emotional engagement. Consider the silent opening montage in Pixar's Up. Raise your hand if you've seen this. Okay, if you have not seen this movie, I know it's an animated movie, watch this movie. If you have a heart, the first 5 minutes of this movie is going to tear you up. This movie depicts Carl and Ellie's life together. They get married, they renovate a house, and this is in the first 4 minutes. They get married, they renovate a house, and they replace an unfulfilled dream of parenthood with the pursuit of adventure. They have this adventure book, and they're going to go on this adventure. And as they age, they put money in a jar, saving up for this adventure that they're going to go on. But as they get older, Ellie gets sick. She's in the hospital, and she passes away. And Carl is left alone. And at the end of 4 minutes and 20 seconds, your heart breaks for Carl. This show, don't tell technique extends beyond emotional storytelling. For example, a professional writer trying to tell you that a woman is beautiful will not just say she was beautiful. They will show you and reveal to you this fact through the reactions of other characters in the story. For example, as Sally stepped into the repair shop, the clatter and whir of power tools ceased as the mechanics, transfixed, watched her clock into her shift. What do we know about Sally? We don't know what color hair she has, how tall she is. What we do know is that these men are captivated by her, and that's all you need to know. Mark, when writing his gospel, uses the same show and tell technique. He uses this in chapter 5 to establish that Jesus has authority. People that interact with Jesus in chapter 5 are going to recognize this authority by imploring him for something, by bowing down before him for something, by begging him. This is show, don't tell at work. So, landing on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, Jesus met a demon-possessed man. And this event is going to occupy half of chapter 5. Where he lands is approximately over here from what people think. We don't know for sure where he landed. Chuck Swindoll and William Lane suggest he was close to the harbor town of En-Gev on the eastern shore near what today is known as Kersey National Park. The shoreline's flat, yet a mile to the south, a steep slope ascends just 40 yards off the shore. 2 miles beyond that, one can find cavern tombs that were once used as dwellings. Mark chapter 5 and verse 1, they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. This was Gentile country. Verse 2, and when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. So here we are, man with an unclean spirit. Mark characterizes the spirit as unclean, that the man was banished to live in the tombs would have rendered him ceremonially unclean. Moreover, this is a Gentile in a Gentile region. Ceremonial impurity will later connect in the chapter when Jesus heals a woman with a flow of blood. In both cases, this contact does not render Jesus impure. Rather, he cleanses both the man and the woman. Verse 3, and I don't have the rest of these verses up here, so I hope you have your Bibles. Mark 5, verses 3. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. This man dwelt among the tombs, places where rabbis commonly associated with demons. Those who the populace feared and the poor were forced to live in caves at that time. The banishment of this man and the chains were measures of protection. Mark speaks of this man's incredible strength. Think back to the book of Judges when Delilah bound Samson with new ropes. He snapped those ropes as if they were threads. Samson was endowed with supernatural strength from God. Likewise, this possessed man in Mark 5 was endowed with supernatural strength, albeit from the unclean spirits called Legion. You may recall that in Mark chapter 3 and verse 27, Jesus refuted accusations that he expelled demons by Satan's power with the strong man analogy. And here's this analogy from chapter 3. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man, then indeed he may plunder his house. In this analogy, Jesus portrays Satan as the strong homeowner and himself as one capable of binding the strong man. In Mark 5, this concept is illustrated through action. Here, in this event, Jesus demonstrates his greater strength and authority by overcoming this demon-possessed man, a strong man who broke shackles and chains. Now, if you compared this with the account in Matthew, Matthew notes that there are two men that approached Jesus in this event. William Hendrickson, an interpreter, finds no contradiction with this, noting that other evangelists do not expressly write only one man, and that variations in reporting events is common even today. If you ask two people about the same event, they might give you little different details. The possessed man was so tormented that he tried to harm himself. Look at verse 5. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. William Lane observes the function of demonic possession is to distort and destroy the image of God in man. Illness was a secondary effect. While possessed, a person who is made in the Creator's image becomes impaired by a power who would drive them to self-destruction. Verse 6, and when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." Mark Strauss suggests the man may have had the willpower to seek and to run toward help. William Hendrickson suggests that the demons impelled this man to run toward the landing party with hostile intent. But upon recognizing the Son of God, they fell in terror. And they shrieked at Jesus. It says in verse 7, and crying out with a loud voice. So they were shrieking at Jesus at this point. And I'm reminded of James chapter 2 and verse 19. You believe that God is one, you do well. What does the verse say? Even the demons believe and shudder. These demons grovel before Jesus, and Matthew adds, have you come here to torment us before the time? The time they refer to is likely the judgment, and in this instance, spirits in league with Satan, the principal enemy of God, proclaimed Christ's authority on earth. Verse 8, for he was saying to them, come out of that man, you unclean spirit. And Jesus asked him, what is your name? He replied, my name is Legion, for we are many. Now, Jesus asking the name of the demon was not some means of trying to gain mastery over this spiritual entity. The Creator doesn't need the name to master anyone. Rather, the answer that revealed the magnitude of the demonic possession that this man was under, and it revealed the greatness of the miracle that Jesus was about to perform. Who but God was able to cast out so many demons at once? Many demons possessed this man. In Luke 8, verse 2, we read about Mary Magdalene having 7 demons, and in Matthew 12, 43 through 45, Jesus speaks of an unclean spirit re-entering a person and bringing, quote, with it 7 other demons more evil than itself. So whether this response was sincere, evasive, or boastful, the answer, my name is Legion, carried militaristic overtones. This aligns with Mark's thematic focus on spiritual warfare. The composition of a Roman legion fluctuated throughout history. During the imperial period when Christ was alive, it comprised 6,000 infantry and 120 horsemen. Twice in this next passage, the demons will beg. Here we go. And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, saying, send us to the pigs, let us enter them. Luke notes that they begged not to be sent, quote, into the abyss. The word translated abyss literally means bottomless. In Revelation 20, John wrote of the bottomless pit. Peter and Jude wrote of fallen angels kept in chains in gloomy darkness until the judgment. This might have been the fate that they feared. Jesus granted their petition, which underscores, again, his authority over the spiritual realm. Verse 13, so he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. 2,000 pigs would have been worth a fortune. Yet Jesus prioritized the welfare of this man over the lives of those animals. Their destruction, drowning in the sea, raises the question, what became of those demons? And we're just not told. William Lane suggests that in letting the demons enter the swine, Jesus allowed them to continue their destructive work, but not upon a man. Mark 5, starting in verse 14, the herdsmen fled and told it in the city and in the country. And people came to see what it was that had happened, and they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had had the legion, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. So, fearful to absolve themselves of blame, the herdsmen fled to the city. When the people arrived to investigate, they found the previously tormented man sitting peacefully. Verse 16, and those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs. And they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. Luke tells us that they were seized with great fear, and afterwards, this man will beg to go with Jesus. Verse 18. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. And here's verse 19. And he did not permit him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." And verse 20 continues, "And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled." So in the past, Jesus instructed those that he healed to keep that event secret. He placed no such restriction on this man. And notably, in Mark's narrative, Jesus appointed this Gentile as the first missionary to spread the word to Gentiles. And the scripture says that he proclaimed this in the Decapolis. Now, Decapolis literally means 10 cities, and it's these cities from Damascus and all these cities that have black dots below it, including the Scythopolis over here. All of this is Gentile territory. Alexander the Great established those cities originally. These were on the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire. James Edwards finds parallels between Jesus freeing the demon-possessed man and the calming of the sea, which we had in chapter 4, at the end of chapter 4. Now, let's just briefly talk about chapter breaks and verses in your Bible. You can kind of liken those to mile markers. What's a mile marker good for? It tells you where you are, and it tells you how to find something, right? That's what a mile marker is good for. But a mile marker is useless for telling you where the boundary ought to be. Chapters and verses are the same way. If we were to reorganize this, the narrative for this section really begins at the end of chapter 4 with the calming of the stormy sea. So, here are some of the parallels. Jesus quelled both the sea's turbulent waves and the man's inner turmoil. And despite witnessing these miracles, observers responded with fear, not with faith. This applies to the disciples on the stormy sea. This applies to the Gentiles who begged Jesus to leave the region. And in both instances, Jesus replaced chaos with calm. So now we move on to intertwined miracles. There's a pair of intertwined miracles that occur, and this is the second half of the chapter. Mark uses patterns of threes to showcase the Lord's authority over natural and supernatural forces. So here we go. We saw this over nature. Jesus calms a storm. We saw this over demons, this legion of demons. And now we're going to see him exercise natural authority over disease and supernatural authority over death. Natural and supernatural authority. And this, again, this pattern of three that you're seeing here, you will see additional patterns of three as we move through Mark. Mark continues by presenting two intertwined events, and to build suspense, he employs another Markan sandwich. If you've got the handout, I've got a brief definition of that, but here we go. Let's look at the Markan sandwich that we're about to see here. Markan sandwich always has an A-B-A relationship. So, Jesus begs for his daughter, or Jairus begs for his daughter, and then Jesus raises Jairus' daughter. Now, if you removed the middle of that, that would just be one event. It would be a narrative. But what Mark does is he builds anticipation. He builds suspense by interjecting this event where Jesus heals this woman. He shares that with us. A Markan sandwich. So, crowds met Jesus when he landed, and likely this was Capernaum, based on a few people that I read, but ultimately it's unclear, but likely we think it's Capernaum. where he lived in Galilee. Verse 21, and when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him, earnestly saying, my little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be well and live. And he went with him. Luke notes this was the only daughter of Jairus. This is evidence that not everyone in the synagogue opposed Jesus. This official, Jairus, was not a member of the religious elite class. Rather, he was a layperson whose responsibilities would have included building maintenance and organizing the services. We have people like that today. This is somebody that keeps the engine running, right? Crowds, we talked about this before. Crowds both indicate popularity and they also impede access to Jesus. Remember when Jesus healed the paralytic? How did those people have to get the paralytic to Jesus? They had to tear up the roof and lower him down by ropes because the crowd was in their way. We're going to have a similar situation here. That this crowd thronged Jesus, that word will show up in the next verse, meant that they got in the way. Verse 24, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years and who had suffered much under many physicians and had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. So for 12 years, this woman suffered a bleeding disorder, likely related to menstruation, which would render her ritually unclean. This status prevented her full participation in Israel's religious activities. Deemed unclean, she was shunned, barred from entering the synagogue, deprived of physical touch, and forbidden to marry. Thus, she was stigmatized as cursed. For 12 years, she suffered, enduring shame, discouragement, and poverty, spending all that she had on doctors. But Mark tells us her condition grew worse. Verse 27, she had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, if I touch even his garments, I will be made well. And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. So, secretly, she approached Jesus, aiming to avoid rebuke or feeling unworthy of his attention. In ancient times, people commonly believed that a person's power could be transmitted through their clothing. We saw this earlier in Mark 3:10, where the sick sought to touch Jesus. She likely shared this belief, and upon touching the fringe of his cloak, she experienced immediate healing. It was God who directly responded to her faith. Remember, when Jesus was operating, he had the power of the Spirit working through him, the power of God working through him. Verse 30, and Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? And his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, who touched me? And he looked around to see who had done it. Now, of course, Jesus knew who touched him. When God addressed Adam in the Garden of Eden and he asked the question, "Where are you?" Did God not know where Adam was? Of course he knew where he was. Jesus knew who had touched him. Contrast the persistence of this woman with the persistence of Jesus. She heard, she came, she touched. The mark of faith is action. Jesus turned, he asked, he looked around. He stopped. He's on the way to go heal this little girl, and he stops. Who touched me? Jesus sought to engage with this woman directly. After 12 years of being marginalized, this woman was about to be seen. Jesus would dispel her superstitions, relieve her fears of retribution, and restore her status in the community. She would no longer face stigma, isolation, or exclusion. Her actions, driven by faith, forged a new path. Up to verse 33 and 34. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Like Jairus, who fell before Jesus, this woman also fell before Jesus. She confessed her illness and her attempt to be secretly healed. And Jesus, calling her daughter, was an endearing term, and it was a sign that this woman was Jewish. Jesus encouraged and blessed this woman. So this leads us to the final scene in Mark 5. The delay represented here by him stopping and asking, "Who touched me?" and her coming forward. We don't know how long this took, but this might have been enough time, just enough time for this little girl to breathe her last. Yet, by telling the woman who touched him, "Your faith has healed you," Jesus presented her faith as a lesson for Jairus. As a lesson for Jairus. Verse 35. While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." Do not fear, only believe. He gives him this encouragement. As Jesus was still speaking, a messenger brought tidings of hopelessness. It was too late. Time had run out. And Jesus speaks to this man who is at this point terribly shaken by the worst news. Do not fear, only believe. So, Jesus will bring Peter, James, and John into the house. These three disciples are the disciples who witnessed the transfiguration, and they were also with Jesus in Gethsemane when he went a little bit further beyond the disciples. We're not told why Jesus chose these three, but in this event, they will serve as witnesses for this miracle. Verse 37, and he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. So in Palestine, hiring mourners was a customary practice. And according to Matthew, Jesus dismissed them with the command, "Go away." Sleep was a euphemism for death. A euphemism is a fancy word that basically says you take something that's horrible and you give it a word that's a little bit nicer. So sleep is a euphemism for death. We see this in the Gospel of John, chapter 11, starting in verse 11. After saying these things, he said to them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he will recover." Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking rest in sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus has died." A person's spirit leaves their body when they die, and Luke shares an insight into this particular miracle. Luke 8, verse 54 and 55, "But taking her by the hand, he called, saying, 'Child, arise,' and her spirit returned. And she got up at once, and he directed that something should be given her to eat." Restoration of this girl's life is hopeful. Physical death is not final. And in his commentary on Mark, Chuck Swindoll notes that those who die in faith will enjoy everlasting life, while those others will suffer a second death of everlasting punishment. Revelation 2:11, Revelation 20, verse 6, we read of the second death. Restoration of this girl's life is hopeful. William James suggests that Jesus' statement, "The child is not dead but sleeping," signals that in spite of her very real death, she had, quote, "not been delivered over to the realm of death with all of its consequences." This is one interpreter's understanding of this passage. Mark 5 and verse 40, "But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and all those who were with him and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha Kumi, which means, 'Little girl, I say to you, arise.'" Jesus did not repeatedly cry out to God like Elijah did when he raised the widow of Zarephath's son. He did not warm the body as Elisha did when he raised the Shunammite family's son from the dead. Jesus simply took her hand and spoke 2 words in Aramaic, which Mark translates to his readers as, "Little girl, arise." Mark's translation of this phrase suggests that his original audience was primarily Roman, or that they lived outside Palestine where residents would have been familiar with Aramaic. We talked about this in the first lesson and in the second lesson about the audience that this is addressed to. And the general consensus is that Mark was originally addressed to Christians living in Rome. And possibly he wrote this during the time of Nero. That's one idea behind that. The interpreter James Edwards explains that Talitha is a feminine form for the words lamb or youth, and kum is an imperative meaning arise. William Hendrickson notes that this may have echoed a tender call that her mother would have given to her in the morning when she woke her. "Little girl, arise." Verse 42. "And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat." Mark's signature word immediately notably appears twice, emphasizing this girl's instant recovery and the immediate amazement of her family. The miraculous healings of Jesus required no delay or recovery period. Remember when he healed Peter's mother-in-law? What did she start doing right away? She started serving them. Jesus instructed this couple to keep silent. This may have been to shield them from public scrutiny or potential backlash from his detractors. In a later incident, John records that after Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, the chief priests conspired to put Lazarus to death. John chapter 12, starting in verse 9, we read this. When the large crowd of the Jews learned that Jesus was there, they came not only on account of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to put Lazarus to death as well, because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and believing in Jesus. There is a final human touch in verse 43. Jesus told the girl's parents to give her something to eat. Amidst the excitement, Jesus knew this child needed food. Scholars observe similarities between this story and the narrative of the woman healed earlier. William Edwards notes that both the girl and the woman are referred to as daughter. The duration of the girl's life matches the length of the woman's affliction, 12 years. In both situations, Jesus faces mockery. Each narrative involves healing through touch, and each presents themes of ritual and purity. The woman's condition made her unclean, while the girl's death did the same. If you touched a corpse, you were unclean. Finally, in both cases, all human remedies had failed. This required a solution from God. Mark's use of thematic connections in chapter 5 is masterful. You know, before I started studying Mark, I kind of discounted the book as, well, it's a shorter book. It's not as well crafted as perhaps Luke or Matthew. This is far from the truth. It's masterfully crafted, and we should not be surprised at this, because who inspired the work? The Holy Spirit, right? All Scripture is inspired. So he's got the guidance, the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. Now he uses eyewitness accounts from Peter, and he uses Peter's story, but ultimately the hand behind this, crafting the narrative, is God. As we delve deeper into the study of Mark, we will uncover more examples of his skill in weaving a moving narrative. So next week, read Mark chapter 6. In this chapter, Jesus faces rejection in Nazareth, commissions the 12 to preach, and mourns the death of John the Baptist. Afterwards, he will showcase his compassion by feeding the 5,000 and exercising divine power by walking on water. It's one chapter, so it's probably 5 or 6 minutes of your time to read it. For all of you who read this week, thank you for doing so, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks.